The note was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came downstairs that Tuesday morning. A folded piece of paper, leaning against my coffee mug, like he'd placed it there deliberately. Like he wanted it to be the first thing I saw. I remember standing in my robe, hair still flat from sleep, staring at it. Something told me not to open it. Something in my chest already knew. I opened it anyway. Dorothy, I've sold the company. The papers are finalized. I'll be moving forward with my life in a different direction. My attorney will be in touch about the house. You should start thinking about where you'll go. Frank. I read it 3 times. Then I set it back down on the counter, poured my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in complete silence for a very long time. 36 years. That was how long Frank and I had been married. 36 years of a life built together in this house, in this town, with these hands, and he couldn't even tell me to my face. He left a note. He left a note the same way you'd leave a reminder to pick up milk. I want to tell you that I cried. I want to tell you I fell apart right there at that kitchen table. But the truth is, I didn't. What I felt in that moment wasn't grief. It was a cold, quiet clarity, the kind that only comes when something you've been half expecting for months finally arrives. I'd known something was wrong since the previous spring. Frank had started working late again, not the kind of late that meant a deadline or a difficult client, but the kind of late that has a different quality to it entirely. He'd started taking calls in the backyard, walking away from the door before answering. He'd started caring about his appearance in a way he hadn't in years. New shirts, a gym membership. He'd lost 15 pounds and seemed pleased about it in a way he'd never shared with me. I wasn't a fool. I'd been a school librarian for 31 years. I knew how to read between the lines, but I told myself I was wrong. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Frank was a good man, that 36 years of marriage meant something. I told myself these things the way you tell yourself a story you need to believe until you simply cannot believe it anymore. The note ended that story. I sat with my coffee until it went cold. Then I picked up the phone and called my daughter. Claire answered on the second ring. She was always an early riser, even as a child. I could hear her moving around her kitchen in Columbus, the sound of a spoon against a mug. Mom? It's barely 7. Everything okay? Your father left a note this morning, I said. There was a pause. A note. He sold the company. He says his attorney will be in touch about the house. Another pause. Longer this time. Then her voice came back tighter, lower. Mom, where is he? Right now. I don't know. He was gone before I woke up. She said she was coming. I told her she didn't need to. She said she was coming anyway. That was Claire. She had always been the one who showed up. Even as a teenager, when other kids were pulling away from their parents, she was the kind of girl who came home and sat at this same kitchen table and just talked. I had always been grateful for that. I was more grateful for it that morning than I had ever been for anything. I went upstairs after I hung up and I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at the room I had shared with my husband for more than 3 decades. His side of the closet was partially empty. Not fully, he'd been careful about that. Left enough hanging so I might not notice right away. But I noticed. I noticed the gaps between the shirts. I noticed the missing shaving kit from the bathroom shelf. I noticed that the photograph of us at Claire's college graduation, the one that had sat on his nightstand for 11 years, was gone. He had been planning this. He had been planning this for a long time. I went back downstairs and I made a second cup of coffee and I sat down and I started thinking. Not about my feelings. Not yet. Feelings could come later. Right now, I needed to think clearly. Because I understood, even then, that what happened in the next few weeks would determine the rest of my life. Frank had founded Meridian Technical Services in 1994. That was 4 years into our marriage. I remember that year vividly. Claire was 3 years old. I was working full-time at Jefferson Elementary, and Frank had come to me one evening with this light in his eyes that I hadn't seen since we were dating. He had an idea, he said, a small industrial equipment company. He'd been doing the math. He thought it could work. I asked him how much he needed to get started. He said around $40,000. I had been saving since before we got married. I'd been careful, methodical, the way my mother had taught me to be. I had a little over $52,000 in a savings account that I had built entirely on my own. I gave him $40,000 of it without hesitating. Because that's what you do. Because that's what marriage means. You bet on each other. For the first 3 years, Meridian barely broke even. Frank was building client relationships, learning the industry, putting in 18-hour days. I worked. I brought home a steady paycheck. I paid the mortgage on the house that was in both our names, bought the groceries, took Claire to her pediatrician appointments, helped with the bookkeeping on the weekends when Frank needed an extra set of eyes. We did not have a glamorous life during those years. We had a good life, a real one. By the late 90s, Meridian started to grow. By the mid-2000s, it was doing well. By the time Claire finished college, Frank was a genuinely successful businessman. He had 15 employees, then 30, then over 60. He had clients across 4 states. He had a reputation, and I had stood beside him for every single step of it. I had attended every industry dinner, every client reception, every holiday party where I smiled and shook hands and made conversation and represented our family with grace. I had been the stable center, while Frank took risks and swung for the fences. When he lost a major contract in 2009 and came home gray-faced and shaking, I was the one who sat with him at this kitchen table until midnight, talking him through it. When he was ready to give up in 2011, I talked him back from the edge. I knew what Meridian was worth, because I had put myself into it just as surely as he had. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe not with my name on the door, but in every way that mattered. And now he had sold it. And he had left me a note. I didn't know yet how much he'd sold it for. I didn't know who the buyer was, or when the papers had actually been signed, or how long this had been in the works, without a single word to me. I knew nothing, and that, more than the note itself, more than the empty side of the closet, was what frightened me. I was 65 years old. I had a pension from the school district. I had my portion of our shared savings account, though I had no idea what was left in it. I had this house, and I had what I had put into this man's company for 36 years, which was now sitting in some account I had no access to. I thought about calling Frank. I picked up the phone twice and put it back down. What would I say? What would he say? Whatever conversation was going to happen between us now would happen through attorneys, and I needed to find one before he got any further ahead of me than he already was. Claire arrived that afternoon. She walked in the front door and looked at me for a long moment, and then she crossed the kitchen and held me for a while without saying anything. I let her. I needed that more than I'd expected to. We sat down together and I showed her the note. She read it once, set it on the table, and looked up at me with her father's eyes and her grandmother's jaw and said, "Mom, you need a lawyer today." "I know," I said. "Not next week." "I know, Claire." She had already done some research on the drive up. She'd found a name, a woman named Sandra Okafor, a family law attorney based in our county with a long track record in asset division cases. Someone who had handled complicated business valuations in divorce proceedings. Claire had read the reviews, read 2 articles the woman had been quoted in. She slid her phone across the table to me. I looked at the photo on the website. Sandra Okafor was somewhere in her early 50s, a composed and careful-looking woman with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked exactly like someone you would want in your corner. I called the office that afternoon. I had an appointment for the following morning. That night I did not sleep. I lay in the bed that was half empty now, in a way that felt permanent. And I stared at the ceiling, and I asked myself the questions I needed to ask. What did I actually have? What could be taken from me? What had I built that was still mine? And what had I handed over so completely that I could no longer claim it? I thought about that $40,000. I thought about it very carefully. I arrived at Sandra's office 15 minutes early. She came out to meet me herself, which I hadn't expected, and shook my hand with a firm, dry grip and looked me directly in the eye. "Mrs. Harmon?" she said. "Come on back." Her office was calm and orderly. She had a whiteboard covered in careful writing and a bookshelf full of binders with color-coded labels. She listened to me without interrupting for almost 20 minutes, and when I finished, she asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I had any documentation of the original $40,000 transfer to Frank's business account. The second was whether my name had ever appeared on any Meridian documents, tax filings, loan applications, anything at all. I thought about it. "The early tax returns?" I said slowly. "The first 2 or 3 years, Frank filed the business as a sole proprietorship, but our taxes were joint, and I co-signed a small business loan in 1996. $22,000. Sandra wrote something down. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her face settled into a particular kind of focus that told me she had found what she was looking for. "Mrs. Harmon," she said, "in this state, any asset acquired or substantially grown during the course of a marriage is considered marital property, regardless of whose name is on the door. Meridian Technical Services was founded 4 years into your marriage, funded in significant part by money from a joint household, supported by your income and your labor for 36 years, and your name appears on at least one financing document. Your husband does not get to sell that company and simply hand you a note." I sat with that for a moment. "He thinks he does," I said. "I know," she said. "Men like your husband almost always think they do, especially when they believe they're holding all the cards." She paused. "He's not holding all the cards. The next several weeks were not easy. I won't pretend they were." Frank had retained an aggressive attorney of his own, a man named Garrison, who sent letters that were designed, I think, to overwhelm and intimidate. There were claims that Meridian's current value was entirely the result of Frank's individual efforts in the last decade. There were suggestions that my contribution to the household had been adequately compensated by the lifestyle I'd enjoyed. There were implications, none of them stated directly, that I should be grateful for what I might receive, rather than fighting for what I was owed. I handed every letter to Sandra and let her handle it. The discovery process was eye-opening. Meridian had sold for $4.3 million. Frank had already moved a significant portion of the proceeds into a new account, one opened just 10 weeks before the sale was finalized. That timing was not a coincidence, and Sandra made sure the court understood it was not a coincidence. During those weeks, I stayed in the house. This is something I want to be clear about, because people sometimes ask, "Why didn't you leave?" The answer is that I had every legal right to stay. This was my home. My name was on the mortgage. My name was on the deed. Frank was the one who had chosen to leave, and the house was not going anywhere until a court told me otherwise, and no court was going to tell me otherwise. Sandra made that very clear to me on day 1, and I held on to it like a handhold on a steep wall. The house was mine until it wasn't, and it was going to stay mine. There were hard nights. I'd be lying if I said there weren't. Nights when I sat at this kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold and thought about 36 years of mornings in this kitchen, 36 years of ordinary Tuesdays that I had no idea were building toward this. I thought about the woman I had been at 29, standing in a church in a dress my mother had helped me pick out, so certain that I understood what I was stepping into. I had understood so little. Claire called every evening without fail. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes she just stayed on the line while I was quiet. She didn't push me to feel things I wasn't ready to feel, or to forgive things I wasn't ready to forgive. She just stayed present. That is the greatest gift anyone gave me during those weeks. I also, for the first time in many years, started talking to my neighbor Ruth. Ruth had been widowed 6 years earlier and had navigated that particular kind of aloneness with a practicality and a grace that I had admired from a distance, without ever thinking I would need to study it up close. We started taking walks in the morning, around the neighborhood, nothing ambitious, just movement and air and company. She never asked me for details I wasn't ready to share. She'd been through enough herself to know that some things you carry quietly for a while before you can set them down and look at them. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday in late October. I wore the navy blazer I had bought for Claire's law school graduation, the one I had always thought made me look like someone who meant business. Sandra met me in the parking lot. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Ready," I said. And I was surprised to find I meant it. The numbers were not simple. Garrison presented a valuation argument that attempted to attribute most of Meridian's recent growth to Frank's individual enterprise, claiming that the business I had helped seed in 1994 was essentially unrecognizable from the company that had sold in 2026. Sandra dismantled this argument piece by piece. She had brought in a forensic accountant who had traced the business's capitalization history back to its founding. She had the original loan documents with my co-signature. She had the joint tax returns. She had a carefully built timeline showing that the periods of Meridian's most significant growth had coincided directly with periods when Frank had faced personal stress, the 2009 contract loss, the 2011 crisis, and had relied on the stability of our household, my income, my management of our family life, to keep going. I sat at that table and I listened to Sandra present my life as evidence. All the invisible things I had done, all the years of holding things together quietly, without recognition, without stock options, or a seat at the table, or even a line in the company history. Sandra put it all on the table and named it for what it was. Frank sat across from me for the first time since the morning he had left. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly now in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. He didn't meet my eyes. The settlement took 4 more weeks to finalize after that session. In the end, I received 43% of the net sale proceeds, just over $1.8 million plus the house, which Frank agreed to sign over to me entirely in exchange for a slightly reduced share of the liquid assets. I also kept my pension and our joint savings account, which had not been touched, and I received a structured maintenance arrangement for a transitional period. When Sandra called to tell me the final numbers, I was sitting right here at this kitchen table. I thanked her. I set down the phone. I looked out the window at the backyard where the oak tree Frank had planted for our 10th anniversary was just starting to turn orange at the edges. I sat with it for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. People expect a story like this to end with triumph, with a fist in the air, with some kind of dramatic vindication. And there was something that felt like vindication. I won't pretend there wasn't. 36 years of unseen work, finally seen, finally named, finally counted. But underneath that was something quieter and more complicated. Grief, I think. The real grief I hadn't let myself feel yet. Not for Frank. Whatever love I had carried for that man had been folding itself away slowly for longer than I wanted to admit. But for the life I had thought I was living, for the story I had told myself about who we were and what we had built together. Losing that story is its own kind of loss, and no settlement amount makes it simple. I called Claire. She picked up before the first ring had finished. "Mom, it's done," I said. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing. I thought about it genuinely, the way she deserved me to think about it. I looked around the kitchen at the table where I had drunk 36 years of morning coffee, at the window above the sink where the light comes in at a particular angle in October that has always been my favorite light, at the magnets on the refrigerator that Claire had brought me from every city she'd ever visited, Chicago and New Orleans and Portland and Denver. A little map of her life stuck to my kitchen appliance. "I'm going to be," I said. And I believed it. The house is mine now, just mine, for the first time in my adult life, which is a strange and not entirely unwelcome feeling. I have repainted the living room a color Frank always said he didn't care for. I have rearranged the bedroom furniture. I have started taking a watercolor class on Thursday evenings at the community center. Something I had talked about doing for 15 years and never gotten around to. Ruth and I still walk in the mornings. Last week, she brought her friend Marguerite, who moved into the neighborhood recently after her own children finally convinced her to leave the house she'd lived in for 40 years in rural Kentucky. Marguerite is 71 and has opinions about everything and makes me laugh without trying to. We walked 4 miles last Wednesday, and none of us noticed until we checked our phones. I am not telling you this story because I want your sympathy. I have enough of my own resources for the hard nights. I am telling you this story because I think there are women who need to hear it. Women who have spent decades doing the invisible work, the thankless work, the work that doesn't come with a title or a salary or a retirement package. Women who have been made to feel that what they contributed doesn't count, doesn't add up to anything, can simply be folded into a note and left on a counter. It counts. Every single year of it counts. And there are people who know how to count it. I am 65 years old and I live alone in a house that belongs to me. And I am learning to paint watercolors very badly on Thursday evenings, and I have more than enough. I have my daughter. I have the oak tree in the backyard. I have Ruth and Marguerite and the particular October light that comes through my kitchen window. And I have every morning of the rest of my life, which is mine entirely now to decide what to do with. That is more than enough. That is, in fact, everything.